A human can still watch a 2-hour film, read a novel, and solve complex problems for hours at a time, yet somehow cannot survive a 1-2 second delay without checking for a new signal, which suggests the issue was never attention span in the first place, but what attention is being trained to prioritize. And the strange part is how quickly the brain adapts when reward timing becomes unpredictable. By 2026, short attention span is no longer a symptom. It is a byproduct of large-scale reinforcement conditioning where information environments have been optimized to deliver variable reward density at extreme frequency, reshaping what the brain classifies as worth sustaining focus on. What most explanations get wrong is assuming distraction is failure. In reality, it is adaptation to competing stimulus economies where every second of silence is treated as an opportunity cost against potentially higher value input. And this is where psychology starts to break down. Because attention is not a fixed resource. It is a dynamic allocation system governed by dopamine-driven reward anticipation loops, constantly updating what deserves continued processing based on predicted payoff. When the environment increases uncertainty and reward variability, switching becomes more efficient than persistence. But what makes this even more unusual is how platforms have learned to exploit that switching threshold. Every scroll introduces novelty at just the right interval to prevent full saturation while avoiding cognitive fatigue, creating a controlled state of perpetual partial engagement. And this detail changes everything. Because instead of deep focus collapsing, it gets replaced by rapid focus cycling. The brain still concentrates, but only in short bursts optimized for immediate relevance detection rather than sustained analytical depth, which leads to a far darker mechanism. Historical attention systems used linear reinforcement, effort first, reward later. Modern systems invert that sequence. Reward is partially delivered before effort completes, then extended through uncertainty, mimicking gambling-style intermittent reinforcement schedules that behavioral psychology has repeatedly shown to maximize compulsive engagement. And researchers noticed something unexpected. The most effective interruptions are not loud ones, but unresolved ones. A partially seen message, an unfinished video, a clipped sentence. The brain treats incompletion as cognitive tension, and tension as priority. This is where cognitive dissonance quietly enters the system. Because once an unfinished narrative exists, the brain attempts closure, even when no meaningful closure is available. That unresolved loop becomes a persistent background process competing with other cognitive tasks, effectively fragmenting attention without conscious awareness. But what makes this even more unusual is how social validation accelerates the fragmentation. Each notification is not just information, it is status uncertainty resolution. A like, a reply, a mention all function as micro-updates to social standing, which the brain prioritizes over abstract tasks because social positioning historically had survival value. And this detail changes everything. Now attention is not just competing between tasks, it is competing between identity states. Who I am in the group becomes more urgent than what I am trying to understand, especially when group feedback is unpredictable and intermittent, which leads to escalation inside the reward system. Because unpredictability is more addictive than consistency. Variable reward schedules produce higher engagement than fixed ones, which is why infinite scrolls, algorithmic feeds, and autoplay systems outperform structured content delivery, even when the structured content is higher quality. But what makes this even more unusual is how quickly the brain begins to optimize for switching cost reduction rather than depth gain. It learns that jumping early prevents missing higher value input elsewhere, even if that higher value input rarely exists. And this detail changes everything again. Because attention is no longer anchored to task value. It is anchored to opportunity scanning. The mind becomes a continuous evaluation engine, rapidly reassessing whether the current input is still the best available option in the environment, which leads to a structural collapse of deep focus conditions. Deep work requires sustained prediction stability. Modern information environments introduce constant prediction volatility. Every notification, feed refresh, or content suggestion resets the expected reward landscape, forcing attention to reallocate. But researchers notice something even more counterintuitive. People do not actually prefer distraction. They prefer reduced uncertainty. Switching provides a false sense of control over unknown input streams, even when it reduces overall productivity. And this is where psychology starts to loop back on itself. Because the more a person switches, the more fragmented their internal narrative becomes. Fragmentation increases perceived need for external updates, which increases checking behavior, which further fragments cognition, A feedback loop forms where attention loss feels like environment optimization. But what makes this even more unusual is how productivity guilt enters as a secondary reinforcement layer. Every interruption is followed by self-correction attempts, habit tracking, or focus apps, which themselves introduce additional micro-interruptions, reinforcing the same instability they aim to solve. And this detail changes everything again, because now attention is not just being stolen, it is being self-managed into depletion. The system no longer requires external force to fragment focus. The user actively participates in optimizing the fragmentation process under the belief that control equals improvement, which leads to a final escalation layer. Even in environments designed for long-form focus, the expectation of interruption persists. The mind anticipates distraction before it arrives, allocating cognitive resources to potential interruptions rather than current input, effectively splitting attention preemptively. And that creates the final paradox. The brain becomes extremely good at reacting quickly, filtering rapidly, and switching efficiently but progressively, worse at staying long enough for anything to fully resolve before the next predicted interruption appears. So, attention span does not shrink. It disperses. And once dispersion becomes the default state, even silence starts to feel like missing information somewhere else that might matter more than whatever is right in front of you, which makes you wonder whether focus is actually gone or just permanently outbid by everything that learned how to interrupt it better. Anyway, if you manage to stay until the end without checking something else, that's either impressive or suspicious. Like, subscribe and try not to test your attention against the algorithm again.